Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The wind carried a low, steady whistle through the broken boards of the old barn. Dust moved like smoke across the ground, rolling between weathered fence posts and the carcass of a wagon long left to rot. On the edge of this quiet, half-forgotten town stood Lena, her shoulders drawn tight against the cold morning air. Her dress was torn at the hem, faded to a dull gray from too many washings in dirty rivers. Mud clung to her boots, cracked and stiff from miles of travel. The strap of her bag, little more than a sack with one handle, had rubbed her shoulder raw. She had not slept properly in 3 nights. A scar ran from his jaw to the edge of his neck, and he had the kind of quiet that unsettled men used to noise. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for a roof, a meal, and a place where no one knew his name. Elias had once been a ranch foreman near Yuma, respected for his discipline and fairness. But a year ago, one of the ranch hands, his younger brother by blood, was killed in a drunken argument that turned into gunfire. No witnesses, no trial, just a dead man and Elias standing beside him with a smoking revolver. The law had called it self-defense, but the town called it murder. He'd left before the whispers turned into something worse. The cowboy was in his late 30s, tall, lean from years of long days and short meals. His face was quiet, the kind that didn't give away much, though a long, pale scar along his jaw hinted at a past that hadn't been peaceful. He had the look of someone who had lived through something heavy and never quite set it down again. Cole didn't get many visitors, not since his brother's death and the war that had taken half the young men from this land. He'd come west to start over, to work the ranch alone, fixing what he could, letting the rest rot if it meant no one would bother him. Now, at the sound of that hesitant knock, he hesitated. He'd learned long ago that every stranger carried a story that could turn into trouble. Still, he wiped his hands on a rag and unlatched the door. Lena stood there, half in shadow. For a second, neither spoke. The air between them was cold and dry, filled only by the slow snort of a horse from the stalls behind him. Her eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but steady. He could see she'd been walking for days, her dress stiff with dust, her cheeks wind-burned. She looked like someone pushed past pride, but not past hope. "I'm looking for work," she said. Her voice shook at first, but steadied as she spoke. "I can cook, clean, mend, anything you need. I need a place to stay." Cole leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, studying her. His silence stretched long enough that she started to fidget. In his eyes, she wasn't a threat, but she wasn't easy to trust either. He'd seen enough lost souls drift through the frontier. Some ran from hunger, some from shame, some from the law. He wondered which kind she was. Lena lowered her eyes briefly, then forced them back up. "Please," she said, the word quiet but solid. "I'll earn it." Cole finally stepped aside. "You could start with the well. Pump's been sticking since winter." She nodded once, quick, before he could change his mind. No questions, no argument. She followed his gesture to the side of the barn and got to work immediately. By noon, the air was hot and sharp with the smell of dry wood and horse sweat. Lena's hands were raw from the iron pump handle. The well water splashed cold against her wrists, streaking through the dust. Cole watched from a distance as she worked. No wasted movements, no complaints, just quiet persistence. He respected that. Most drifters would have already quit. She felt his eyes on her and straightened her back, refusing to show exhaustion. Inside, her stomach ached from hunger. The last loaf she'd carried from the previous town had gone moldy 2 days ago. Her legs trembled from fatigue, but she reminded herself that this was survival. She wasn't going back to the rail towns or the cold nights under bridges. Not again. By late afternoon, she had swept the barn, scrubbed the trough, and lit the stove. Her muscles throbbed. Her fingers stung from blisters that had broken open. She didn't look for praise. She only hoped she wouldn't be told to leave before sunset. Cole sat at the rough wooden table, hat set aside, hands clasped. The quiet between them filled the room like a heavy blanket. The stew she'd made from leftover beans and salt pork simmered softly. It smelled better than anything he'd eaten in weeks. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Lena. Just Lena." Where you headed? She hesitated. Nowhere. Just trying to stop moving. He nodded, understanding more than he said. That was enough. He took his first bite of stew, slow, then another. She watched his face, trying to read judgment or dismissal, but found none. You can stay in a loft, he said simply. There's blankets up there. You work, you eat. Her relief didn't show much on her face, but her shoulders eased. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Cole gave a short nod and returned to his meal. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't ask about the picture of a young man on the shelf, a soldier's portrait, half-faded, framed in dust. That night, when the ranch went still, Lena lay awake in the loft. She could hear the creak of wood under the wind, the steady breathing of horses below. The smell of hay was strong but clean. For the first time in months, she was under a roof that didn't belong to a stranger waiting to use her and discard her. Her mind raced despite the quiet. What if he changed his mind by morning? What if the townsfolk saw her and started talking again? What if the same thing happened here as before? She tried to silence the questions, but fear stayed with her, like a bruise that never healed. Down below, Cole sat alone by the dying fire, the glow outlining the edges of his tired face. He stared at the rifle leaned against the wall and thought about the years he'd spent trying to forget the things he'd done and the people he'd failed to save. Hiring her had been a risk. He didn't trust easily, and strangers brought memories he didn't want stirred. But something in her eyes, something that looked too much like his own exhaustion, had made him open the door. He turned down the lamp, listened to the rain starting again outside, and let the thought settle that maybe, for the first time in a long while, the silence in the house didn't feel entirely empty. The morning broke with the sound of a rooster echoing through the dry valley. The ranch yard glistened with dew, and faint smoke rose from the barn chimney. Lena was already awake, standing by the well, sleeves rolled up, drawing water with a steady rhythm. The pump creaked with every pull, metal against metal, rough but reliable. Her hands were cracked and sore from the day before, yet she worked without hesitation. The cold water hit her fingers, numbing them for a second before the sting faded. She told herself that pain meant purpose, and for once, she had both. Inside, Cole sat at the small table, a tin mug of black coffee between his hands. He listened to the sounds outside, the splash of water, the rattle of the bucket chain, and something unfamiliar stirred in him. For years, his mornings had been silent except for the wind and the shuffle of animals. Now there was another rhythm. It unsettled him a little, the idea of sharing space again, even with someone who hardly spoke. Lena stepped inside, her boots muddy but her posture firm. This town runs on order, not sympathy. The deputy in the corner, his lips swollen from Elias's punch, smirked. Elias could almost hear him breathing, heavy with satisfaction. For a moment, Elias's hand twitched toward his belt, but he stopped himself. He'd learned long ago that quick hands never fix dirty hearts. Martha, the widow, broke the silence. "Sheriff, please. The boy's done no wrong. My niece." The sheriff slammed his palm on the desk. "Enough. You think folks care about the truth? What matters is what they believe, and they've already decided." Elias's eyes hardened. He'd seen this before. Towns that used morality as a weapon. Men like the sheriff who built their authority on fear, not law. Cole broke the quiet first. "Where do you come from before here?" Lena froze mid-bite. The question was simple, but it landed heavy. "North," she said after a pause. "A mining camp near Red Hollow. Was supposed to be work there, but they don't hire women. Not for anything decent." She didn't mention the nights she spent hiding behind supply crates or the man who'd told her she could stay if she earned her keep. The memory still made her jaw tighten. Cole watched her, not asking for more. He wasn't the kind to pry, but he noted the small tremor in her voice. He knew that tone. He'd heard it in men coming back from war, trying to tell the truth without saying it out loud. "You got any family left?" he asked. "No," she said, plain and final. "Not for a long time." He nodded. "That makes two of us." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and for the first time since she arrived, his face showed something human, the faint pull of memory. By midday, the air turned warm and dry. Cole led her to the south pasture where the fence had come loose in 3 places. "You'll hold the post," he said, handing her a pair of gloves that were too big for her hands. "Don't worry about the wire. I'll handle that part." She followed, keeping quiet but observant. The sun baked their backs as they worked side by side. The earth smelled of iron and sweat. Lena pressed her weight against the wooden post as Cole tightened the wire with his gloved hands. She felt the vibration through the wood, the strength behind each pull. "You always work alone?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't look up. "Used to have a hand. Left 2 winters back when the fever took his wife. Why not hire another?" He paused, driving a nail through the hinge of the gate. "Too many talk, too few work." That ended the conversation. But she understood. Silence wasn't just his way. It was his defense. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky a hard orange, Lena scrubbed dishes by the well, her reflection trembling in the water. She thought of the towns she'd passed, the looks people gave her, the unspoken questions about who she was, what she'd done. Here, no one had asked those things yet. It was strange, almost frightening, to not be accused of anything. Inside, Cole cleaned his rifle, the same ritual he did every night. He glanced toward the window, where Lena's silhouette moved slowly, steady, deliberate. Something in that image, her alone, working past exhaustion without complaint, reminded him of the women in his old camp hospitals, those who stitched wounds and buried their dead before dawn. He set the rifle down and rubbed his forehead, uneasy with the thought. When she finally came in, he spoke again. "You can use the wash basin by the stove. There's soap on the shelf." She hesitated. "Thank you." Her voice was soft, like she wasn't used to being offered anything. She washed in silence, the sound of water filling the small room. Cole sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker through the cracks of the stove door. "Cole," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Why'd you let me stay?" He didn't look up right away. "Could use the help. And you didn't look like someone who'd quit." She nodded slowly, but she knew there was more to it, something he wasn't ready to say. "Do you ever go into town?" "Only when I have to. Not much left there worth the trouble." "People said the same about me," she murmured, half smiling. He looked at her then, really looked, and the corner of his mouth twitched as if he almost smiled back, but didn't. "They're wrong," he said simply. She didn't answer. But that night, as she lay in the loft listening to the steady rhythm of his boots pacing downstairs, she felt something unfamiliar. Safety. It wasn't comfort yet. Not warmth or belonging, but safety. Below her, Cole checked the lock on the barn door twice. Old habits. As night settled, Elias laid his coat over her shoulders again, just as he had that first night. She didn't protest this time. She simply looked at him once and said, "Thank you." He sat by the fire, listening to her slow, steady breathing as she drifted to sleep. For the first time in months, Elias didn't feel like a man running. He felt like a man heading somewhere. He just didn't know where yet. Far in the distance, a faint light flickered, torches on the horizon. The law was still coming. But this time, he wasn't facing it alone. The desert stretched ahead of them like a sheet of white fire when the sun rose. The air shimmered above the sand, and every breath carried grit. Elias Boone and Clara Mayfield had been riding since dawn, the horse's steps slow and uneven, its shadow sliding across dry stone. The air smelled of iron and dust, and every sound, hoofbeats, wind, leather creaking, seemed sharper than it should. Elias led the horse on foot again, the reins wrapped loosely around his hand. Sweat ran down his neck and soaked into his collar. He walked with the steady rhythm of a man who'd done this before, who knew that panic was deadlier than thirst. Clara sat upright in the saddle, but her arms trembled with fatigue. She hadn't slept well the night before. The fear of pursuit had kept her half awake, watching the horizon. After a long stretch of silence, she spoke. "Do you think they're still coming?" Elias squinted back toward the west. The trail behind them had no dust, no riders, only the flat burn of the morning light. "They'll come," he said, "but they'll waste time arguing who leads. Men like that always do." She watched him for a moment. "You sound sure." He nodded once. I've seen how lawmen chase things that don't fit their stories. They talk about justice, but it's pride that makes them ride. That line hung between them. Clara didn't argue, but she understood. She understood that kind of pain, not the same loss, but the same habit of pretending it no longer hurt. I'm sorry, she said softly. He nodded once. Nothing to be sorry for. You didn't know. He walked past her and poured the feed for the hens, moving with slow, deliberate motions. She watched him work for a moment, then joined in without another word. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was respectful, two people acknowledging grief without trying to fix it. That afternoon, a storm began to build far out on the horizon. The wind came first, warm and uneasy, rattling the shutters. The horses grew restless in the corral, pacing in tight circles. Cole looked at the sky and muttered, "It'll be a rough one." He sent Lena to gather the blankets and bring the lanterns inside while he secured the barn doors. The rain hit hard not long after, hammering the roof with a sound like iron nails. The wind roared down the valley, pushing dust through the cracks in the windows. When Cole came in, soaked to the skin, he hung his coat by the fire and checked each latch on the doors twice. They ate a quick meal by the fire, beans and bread, the same as always. The air inside was heavy, warm from the stove, but trembling with the force of the storm outside. Lightning flashed through the gaps in the shutters, cutting across Lena's face as she sat near the window. She hugged her knees, trying to stay calm. Storms made her uneasy. They reminded her of nights on the road when she had nowhere to hide. Cole noticed her shaking hands. "It'll pass," he said quietly. "I know," she whispered. "Just storms don't sit well with me." He didn't ask why. Instead, he got up, pulled another blanket from the chair, and set it around her shoulders. She looked up, startled by the simple act of kindness. "Thank you." He nodded and sat back down, rubbing his palms together near the fire. "You get used to them out here," he said after a while. "They come hard, but they go quick." For a time, neither spoke. The fire cracked, and the rain shifted to a dull roar on the roof. Lena found herself studying him when the light caught his face, the faint scar along his jaw, the tiredness in his eyes. There was a stillness about him, the kind that comes from a man who's already seen everything that can break a person and lived through it. She wanted to ask him about the war, about what had happened to his brother, but she didn't. Some truths didn't need to be said aloud to be understood. When the thunder came close enough to shake the floorboards, she flinched. Cole looked over and saw her eyes close, her body tightening against the sound. Without a word, he shifted closer, sitting on the floor beside her. "You didn't even know me." He shrugged slightly. "Didn't have to. I knew what they were." The answer carried weight. It said more about him than any confession could. He was a man driven by something deeper than heroism, guilt, maybe, or the need to do one right thing after too many wrong ones. The conversation fell quiet again. The fire hissed as Elias poured a little water from the canteen onto the flames to keep them small. Clara lay on her side, using her blanket as a pillow. Her breathing slowed, but Elias stayed awake, listening. He thought about his brother again, about the night the shot rang out and how he'd never meant for it to end that way. Every step since then had been a kind of penance. Maybe staying was its own kind of courage. By the time the storm eased, the air inside had gone still and heavy with heat. Cole stood, stretched his sore shoulders, and checked the roof for leaks. Lena handed him a dry cloth, and when his hand brushed hers, both froze for a heartbeat, not out of attraction, but out of shock at what human closeness felt like after so long without it. When she finally went to sleep that night, the storm gone, Lena lay awake for a long while listening to the quiet. It wasn't the uneasy silence of the road. It was steady, grounded. She could hear Cole downstairs, his boots pacing once before settling. She knew then that he was a man of habit, every action deliberate, every silence earned. The desert wind cut cold across their faces, and Clara tightened her grip on the reins as Elias led the way. By mid-morning, they crossed a stretch of hardpack where wagon ruts from years past still carved lines through the ground. Elias stopped, kneeling to study the tracks. "Freight wagons," he murmured. "Old route to Bitterwells. Means we're close." But something about the tracks caught his eye. Fresh hoof prints, too many for a small patrol. Maybe 5 or 6 riders. Not locals, not miners. He stood slowly, jaw tightening. Change of plan, he said. We'll cut south through the wash. Clara frowned. Why? We're almost there. Because whoever left those tracks isn't heading for trade. They're hunting. She didn't argue. The sky was a hard, perfect blue, and the light hit the ranch in long stripes across the yard. Cole was already outside, working the fence line. His sleeves were rolled up, his hat pulled low, his movements measured and deliberate. The ground was soft underfoot from the rain, and the horses moved slow, careful not to sink into the mud. Lena stepped out from the house with a pail of feed and a calm she hadn't felt in a long time. For once, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She had survived enough winters and empty towns to know peace when it came, even if it was quiet and fragile. The storm had shaken something loose in both of them. Not love, not yet, but a steady understanding that they were no longer strangers surviving under the same roof. She passed Cole on her way to the barn. The south pen's still standing, she said. Looks like the fence held. He glanced up from his work, gave a brief nod. You did good work yesterday. It wasn't much of a compliment, but from him it meant something. Lena hid a small smile and went inside the barn. The morning chores carried on without interruption. The clatter of buckets, the creak of the pump handle, the soft thud of boots on wood. Everything in this place had a rhythm, and she found herself falling into it. Yet beneath that rhythm, questions lingered, questions she hadn't dared to ask. What would happen when someone from town came looking? What did Cole do before the war? Why did he choose to stay out here, surrounded by ghosts and silence? And if she stayed long enough, what would people start saying about her? By midday, those thoughts faded into the heat. Cole was fixing the gate when he looked up toward the distant road. A single rider approached, tall, broad-shouldered, with a long coat and a worn hat pulled low. Lena noticed his posture first. Confident, the kind of man used to getting what he wanted. Clara sat wrapped in his coat, half awake, her hair tangled, her eyes wary but steady. They're close, he said. A few miles, maybe less. Her breath caught, but she nodded, swallowing the fear. We can't keep running forever. We won't, he answered. We'll stop when it's worth stopping. She watched him load the revolver again, counting the rounds. 5 left. And if they find us? Elias paused for a moment before holstering the weapon. Then we make them listen, he said simply. They rode south, following the dry creek bed. The land changed subtly. The sand gave way to broken rock and small clumps of sagebrush. The air smelled faintly of iron. The sky, cloudless and wide, pressed down on them with heat that built fast. Clara's face flushed under the sun, but she didn't complain. Her hands stayed tight on the reins, her posture steady, though exhaustion was clear in the way her shoulders drooped. By noon, they spotted something unusual along the trail. A series of weathered wooden markers driven into the ground, half buried by sand. Elias dismounted, wiping the sweat from his brow. The posts were carved with initials and numbers, names that had faded but not disappeared. Old clay markers, he muttered. Mining country. Clara looked around. Do people still work here? Not for years, he said. The mines ran dry. Most men packed up and left. Some didn't. What do you mean? He pointed to the markers. Those names. He turned back to Cole. Just being neighborly. Some of us still checking on folks. You've checked, Cole said. Now you can ride back. For a moment, tension hung in the air. Mason's gaze flicked between them, a man reading more than what was said. Finally, he tipped his hat and climbed back onto his horse. Careful who you let stay on your land, Harper. Folks talk. Cole didn't answer. He just watched until the rider disappeared down the ridge. Only then did he turn to Lena. You all right? She nodded, but her voice was tight. Men like that don't scare me anymore. He studied her face, the slight tremor in her jaw. Maybe not, he said, but he'll talk. I've been talked about before, she replied. It never killed me. He didn't argue. Still, the look in his eyes carried worry. Not because of gossip, but because gossip in towns like Clearwater could grow into something meaner. That night, the ranch was quiet again, but the silence felt different. Lena sat by the table, patching a tear in one of Cole's shirts, the lamplight warm on her face. Cole leaned against the wall, drinking coffee gone cold, watching the steady motion of her hands. "You worked for someone before Red Hollow?" he asked suddenly. She looked up cautious. "A family near Prescott. 3 sons, 1 father. The mother passed." "Why'd you leave?" "The father started drinking after she died. One night, he mistook me for her." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. "I left before morning." Cole's fingers tightened around the mug, knuckles white. He said nothing for a long time, then simply murmured, "You did right." "I didn't have much choice," she said quietly. "I've been running ever since." Cole set the cup down. "You don't have to run anymore." She wanted to believe that, but she'd learned not to trust promises. Not from men, not from luck, not even from herself. "Maybe," she said softly, eyes on the thread in her hand. Later that night, she stepped outside to breathe the cool air. The land stretched dark and endless, the stars sharp above the ridge. She could see the faint light from Hale's ranch in the distance. For a moment, the peace of the place felt fragile, like one whisper could break it. Behind her, the door opened. Cole stepped out, hands in his pockets. "He won't bother you again," he said. "How can you be sure?" "Because I made it clear enough." She didn't ask what he meant by that, whether he'd spoken to Mason or warned him in some other way. She didn't need to know. She just nodded. "Thank you." They stood side by side in silence, looking out over the land. A coyote called somewhere in the distance. Lena's mind drifted to her old life. The people who had turned her away, the nights she'd hidden in barns like this one, praying for morning. She wondered if those people would even recognize her now. Cole's voice broke the quiet. "This place isn't much," he said, "but it's enough if you make it work. That's all I've been trying to do." She looked at him, studying the lines on his face, the way the light caught the scar along his jaw. "You built this by yourself?" "Me and Elias," he said. He had big plans, horses, crops, maybe a family one day. "I just wanted the quiet. Now I've got it, but—" He trailed off, eyes fixed on the dark fields. "Quiet gets heavy sometimes." Lena understood that perfectly. She'd carried silence for years, too. Only hers came with shame and fear instead of loneliness. "Maybe that's why you needed someone to help," she said softly. He looked at her then, and for the first time, there was something open in his gaze. Not pity, not attraction, just recognition. "Maybe," he said. When they went back inside, the lantern's flame flickered low, and the sound of the wind brushed against the windows. Neither of them spoke again, but both knew something had shifted. The fear that had followed her for so long didn't feel as close now. And for the first time in years, Cole Harper didn't feel like a man waiting for the past to catch up to him. The next few weeks passed without trouble, but an uneasy quiet lingered over the ranch, the kind that comes when you know someone's been talking but can't yet hear the words yourself. The spring air was warmer now, the grass rising green along the creek bed, and the long days of work filled every hour with purpose. Yet even with the hum of labor around them, both Cole and Lena felt the shift, the town's eyes turning, whispers finding their way through the wind. Lena noticed it first on her supply trips. At the general store, conversations cut short when she entered. The clerk, who used to greet her politely, now kept his distance, handing over goods without small talk. The blacksmith's wife, who once offered her a ride back to the ranch, now looked through her as if she wasn't there. She didn't need to ask why. It always started the same way. A man like Mason Hale dropped a story into the dust, and soon it grew legs of its own. When she returned that day, Cole saw the tension in her face before she even spoke. "What happened?" he asked, setting aside the saddle he'd been repairing. "Nothing new," she said, forcing a shrug. "Just people deciding what kind of woman I am." He wiped his hands and looked at her. "You don't owe them anything." "I know," she said, "but they'll still talk. And they'll talk louder until they're sure you can hear them." Cole leaned on the workbench, his gaze steady. "Let them. I've been called worse by better." Despite his calm tone, she could tell it bothered him. He'd lived most of his life avoiding trouble, staying quiet, keeping to himself. Now, because of her, that silence was cracking open again. That night, after supper, Lena sat outside on the porch steps, the lantern's glow catching the edge of her hair. The sound of crickets filled the empty spaces between thoughts. She pulled her shawl tighter and stared into the distance where Hale's ranch light still burned faintly on the ridge. She didn't want to bring it up, but the question pressed too hard to ignore. "Cole," she said finally, without turning around, "what if this gets worse? What if they come here one night, trying to drive me off?" He stopped in the doorway, his shadow falling across her. "Then they'll find I'm still here," he said. She looked up at him, not reassured, but aware that he meant it. There was no bravado in his voice, just simple certainty. The next morning, a letter arrived, carried by a boy from town. It wasn't signed, just folded once, the words written in heavy ink. "You're letting a whore live under your roof. Decent men don't keep that kind of company." Lena found it on the porch rail before Cole did. She read it once, folded it again, and slipped it into the firebox without a word. When Cole came in for coffee, he saw the corner of the paper curling black among the coals. "What was that?" he asked. "Nothing worth keeping." He watched her expression, the way her jaw set tight, the small tremor in her fingers as she poured the coffee. "They sent something, didn't they?" She didn't answer, but her silence said enough. "She's the proof." A long pause followed. Then another shot, wild and angry, ricocheted off the rocks. The deputy shouted something Elias couldn't make out, and then came the sound of horses shifting and boots scuffing. They were regrouping. He turned to Clara. "We'll ride through the wash at dusk," he said. "They'll expect us to wait it out or come down the main trail. If we move fast enough, we could get ahead of them before dark." Clara nodded, her jaw set. "You really think we can outrun them?" Elias's tone stayed even. "No, but we can outthink them." They spent the next hours in silence, conserving energy. He simply stood beside her as she bought flour, sugar, salt, and coffee, his presence calm but solid as stone. When the clerk hesitated to hand her change, Cole's voice cut through the room like the edge of a blade. "She's working for me. You'll treat her the same as any other hand from this ranch." The man blinked, nodded, and slid the coins across the counter. No one spoke after that. As they walked out, Lena felt the heat rise in her chest. Not from shame, but something like gratitude and anger mixed together. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," he replied. "You don't face a mob by standing alone." They rode home without another word, but the silence was different now. Heavier, more personal. When they reached the ranch, she stayed in the wagon a moment longer, her hands resting on the reins. "I've never had anyone stand up for me before," she said softly. Cole met her eyes. "Then maybe it's about time someone did." That night, the air turned cold again. The wind blew hard through the valley, and the smell of rain carried on it. Lena sat by the fire, sewing patches on a torn quilt. Cole sharpened a knife at the table, the slow scrape of metal steady and even. They worked in silence until she spoke. "You said you lost your brother in the war," she began. "What happened to the rest of your family?" Cole's hand paused on the blade. "Father died before the war. Mother after. It was just the two of us after that." Clara sank to her knees beside the fire Elias built small and low. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce. Elias tore a strip from his sleeve to clean a shallow graze on her arm, one she hadn't even noticed. "You're hurt," he said. She shook her head. "It's nothing." "Everything's something," he replied. His voice was softer than before. As he wrapped the cloth around her arm, their eyes met in the flicker of firelight. Something unspoken passed between them, a quiet understanding born from shared fear and stubborn survival. Clara was no longer someone he was protecting. She was his equal in this fight. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "You said you'd tell the truth if they caught us. What truth is that?" He met her gaze. "That I stayed. That I didn't run this time." She looked down, her hands folded in her lap. "Then maybe I'll tell them something too," she said. "What's that?" "That you didn't just save me. You gave me back my name." Elias didn't answer. He didn't know how. The words hit something inside him he hadn't felt in years, something close to peace. As they sat in silence, he pulled the ledger from his coat and handed it to her. "If I don't make it, you ride east until you reach the fort." When the fire died low, Lena closed the last window and whispered, almost to herself, "I'm not running anymore." Cole, from across the room, heard it, and for the first time in years, the sound of another person's promise felt stronger than the storm outside. Morning came slow and gray, the sky heavy with the kind of clouds that promised rain but never quite delivered. The land looked tired, fences leaning, puddles dried into cracked shapes, the barn roof streaked with dust. Lena woke early, as she always did now, but something in the air felt different. The stillness wasn't peace anymore. It was waiting. She moved through her chores with practiced precision. The pump, the wash, the stove, but her thoughts kept circling back to what Cole had said the night before. Then I'll stay. The words hung in her mind like an echo. She'd meant them, but the weight of staying wasn't light. It carried everything she'd been running from. Her name, her past, her fear of being seen and judged. When she stepped outside with a bucket of feed, she found Cole already in the corral, working a young horse that had been restless for days. His movements were calm and sure, his voice low, steadying the animal with patience that came from years of solitude. She stopped at the fence, watching him for a moment. "You're good with them," she said. He glanced over, sweat running down his neck. "Horses don't lie," he replied. "You treat him fair, they come around. People, that's harder." Lena smiled faintly. Maybe because people remember. He didn't answer right away, only ran his hand along the horse's mane, thinking. "You're right," he said finally. "Some things you never stop remembering." They worked in silence for a while. When the clouds began to break, Cole stopped and wiped his brow. "You heard anything new in town?" he asked. She hesitated. "Nothing said to my face." He frowned. Meaning, meaning they've moved past words. She looked down, twisting the handle of the bucket in her hands. "A man stopped me near the post office. Said I should go before you get caught up in trouble that isn't yours." I don't even know what he meant. Cole's jaw tightened. "You didn't tell me that before. I didn't want to make it worse." "You can't make what's already rotten worse," he said. That evening, after supper, he saddled his horse without saying where he was going. Lena stood in the doorway, drying her hands on a cloth. "Cole, don't," she said quietly. "I just need to talk to someone," he replied, tightening the cinch. "Words, not bullets. You think words will fix this?" "No," he said, swinging into the saddle. "But silence won't either." He rode toward town under a half moon, the sound of the horse's hooves fading down the dirt road. "But if the sheriff bribed men at the fort?" "You think he did?" Elias gave a small, grim nod. "A man who covers his crimes doesn't stop at town lines." Clara sat silent for a long time. She pulled the ledger from her satchel and opened it again. The pages were worn now, smudged from sweat and dirt, but the ink was still legible. She ran her fingers over the lines that spelled out her family's fate, the bribes, the names, the proof that everything she'd been accused of was a lie. She said quietly, "If the army's bought too, what then?" Elias took a breath before answering. "Then we make sure the truth outlives us." When they rode again, the landscape began to change. Sparse cactus turned to patches of dry grass, and on the horizon, the faint outline of a flagpole rose above the ridge. Fort Clay. For a moment, Clara felt her chest tighten with hope, but as they drew closer, her hope turned to unease. There were riders outside the gate, too many for a normal patrol. Elias slowed his horse. "Something's wrong," he said under his breath. The deputy's men hadn't been following out of loyalty, they'd been leading. The sheriff had already sent word ahead. They stopped 100 yards from the fort entrance. A group of soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms dusty, their rifles clean. At their front was a young lieutenant, thin, composed, with sharp eyes that carried the burden of authority he hadn't yet earned. Lena stepped closer, her voice low. "You can't fight the whole town for me." "I don't need to," he said. "Just the one fool who thinks he speaks for it." Something in his tone, quiet, certain, made her believe him. The next morning, a wagon rolled up the hill toward the ranch. Two men from town, the preacher and the sheriff, climbed down, hats in hand. Cole met them at the gate. "Morning," the sheriff said, polite but cautious. "Heard there was a bit of trouble last night. Wanted to clear the air." Cole's expression didn't change. "There's no air to clear. A man came to my place, spoke lies about a woman under my roof, and I told him to keep to his own." The preacher shifted uneasily. "Cole," Folks are uneasy. A woman living alone with a man. People start talking. Cole's reply was firm. Then they can talk while I work. She's my hand, not my secret. He kept his eyes locked on the lieutenant's face as the man flipped through the pages. Line by line, the truth revealed itself. The bribes, the shipments, the falsified reports. Each word was a nail in the sheriff's coffin. The lieutenant's face changed. First confusion, then disbelief, then anger. He snapped the book shut and turned toward the men at the gate. Bring Sheriff Harlan in, ordered sharply. Now! A murmur spread among the soldiers. The posse that had followed Elias appeared moments later, dragging behind them the sheriff himself, red-faced, sweating, his badge glinting under the sun. He tried to speak, but the lieutenant cut him off. You've been running your own court out here, Sheriff, the officer said coldly. I've got your own words to prove it. You'll answer to the territorial judge. Harlan's eyes darted toward Elias, burning with hate. You think this changes anything, Boone? You're still nothing but a killer hiding behind another man's sins. Elias didn't rise to it. He just stood there, steady, calm, the way he always did when the truth was louder than anything he could say. Maybe so, he said, but I didn't hang innocent people to stay clean. The lieutenant ordered Harlan disarmed and bound. His men obeyed without hesitation. The deputy tried to protest, but one glance from his superior silenced him. Clara stood, watching it all unfold, her hands trembling, not from fear this time, but from release. For the first time in years, she saw justice with her own eyes. When it was done, the lieutenant turned to her. Miss Mayfield, he said, you have my word this will reach the court in Tucson. You'll be safe here until then. Elias looked at her, then at the horizon. His work, it seemed, was finally done, but something inside him didn't feel finished. He wasn't built for staying still, and yet, for the first time, he wanted to. That night, they were given quarters inside the fort. Clara sat by the small window, watching the stars through the bars of the frame. Elias leaned against the wall across from her, silent, his hat on the floor. After a long, quiet stretch, she said, You could go now. You've done what you came for. He looked at her. You think that's all this was? She met his eyes, steady. What else? He hesitated. You were the only thing I didn't walk away from. For a moment, the room held only the sound of the wind outside and the crack of the lantern flame. Then she stood and crossed the room, sitting beside him on the cot. She didn't touch him, but she didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It was full. Outside, the desert night was calm again. The law had finally caught up to the truth. The sheriff was in chains. And somewhere deep down, Elias Boone began to believe that a man could stop running if he found the right reason to stay. The trial came 2 weeks later in the dusty town of Tucson. The army escorted Sheriff Harlan and his deputy in chains, their heads low, the weight of their crimes too heavy to carry with pride. Word had spread fast about the ledger, the murders, the false accusations. When the circuit judge arrived, half the town gathered outside the courthouse. They wanted to see justice, or at least a version of it they could believe in. Elias Boone stood at the back of the room, hat in hand, clean shirt borrowed from a soldier. We need to sign some papers if we want the deed under both our names. Lena froze. Both? He nodded, matter of fact. You've worked this land same as I have. You've earned that right. She set down the rag she'd been holding, unsure how to answer. Cole, that's not necessary. I never. It is, he said, his voice quiet but firm. This place stands because of both of us now. If something happens to me, I don't want it taken from you. The law won't care about words. Paper's what lasts. Lena looked at him for a long time, then nodded. All right, she said. We'll go tomorrow. They rode into town the next morning, side by side, the wagon wheels cutting clean lines through the dust. The same people who had once looked away now watched them differently, not with gossip, but with a quiet kind of recognition. When they entered the land office, the clerk looked surprised, but not unkind. Cole placed the papers on the counter, signed his name, then stepped aside so Lena could do the same. Her hand shook slightly, but she wrote each letter clear and steady. When they left, the sun had risen high. She climbed onto the wagon, still holding the pen marks on her fingers, and smiled faintly. Feels strange, she said, to have my name on something that can't be taken. Cole looked at her, a small grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. Feels right. The weeks that followed were the quietest yet. The street was alive with movement. Wagons rolling, shopkeepers closing shutters, laughter from the saloon drifting through the air. But between them, there was only stillness. What will you do now? She asked. He looked at her, then down the long stretch of road leading east. Haven't figured that part out yet. Maybe head toward the border. Maybe find work that doesn't involve running from ghosts. Clara studied him, her voice low but sure. You could stay. He gave a faint smile. And do what? You don't need a gunman in your life, Clara. She stepped closer. I don't need a gunman, she said. But I could use someone who doesn't walk away when things get hard. Elias didn't answer right away. One evening, after a long day fixing the south fence, they sat on the porch, the last of the sun turning the land to gold. Lena had her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her fingers tracing the rim absently. You ever think about going back east? She asked. Cole shook his head. There's nothing left there, just markers and mistakes. And now, he looked at her, his eyes steady in the fading light. Now there's work that matters, a place that's worth keeping. She smiled, the kind that came slow but stayed. And people too, he said. A comfortable silence followed. The cicadas hummed in the distance, the air cooling as the night settled in. For the first time in years, Cole felt something he hadn't let himself feel. Rest. Not peace that comes from running out of fight, but the kind that comes when there's nothing left to hide from. Later that night, as the stars came out sharp and bright, Lena went out to the barn. She stopped at the small wooden cross behind it, the one marked Elias Harper. She knelt there quietly, brushing the dust from the name. He'd be proud of you, she said softly, knowing Cole couldn't hear her. You didn't lose what he started. When she turned, she found Cole standing by the doorway, watching her with that quiet steadiness she'd come to trust. I think he'd like you, he said. Silence had become their language, the kind that didn't need filling. One evening, as they sat side by side, Clara broke the quiet. You ever think about leaving again? Elias looked at her, then out at the horizon where the desert met the sky. Used to think I'd never stop moving, he said. But then I realized running doesn't take you away from pain. It just changes the scenery. She smiled faintly. So what made you stop? He thought for a long moment before answering. You did. The simplicity of it made her blink back tears she hadn't expected. She reached over and placed her hand on his. He didn't pull away. Just the shared look of two people who had already said everything that mattered without ever needing to speak it. The wind moved through the grass outside, steady and soft. The ranch stood still against the morning light. They had both found what they'd been missing all along. Not freedom, not redemption, but something far rarer out on the frontier. Home.